Okay, so the last lecture of the series, and in a fitting way, this is a kind of a meta lecture for us, because it's really about how one looks at the other, or the East. In some ways, you could say that in some ways, that Slavs and Tatars is a mechanism through which to look at other territories beyond ourselves, because a lot of times people think the first question they ask is, why the anonymity? Why do you not use your name? It's actually quite revealing, because it's not anonymous. Obviously, I'm not scrambling my voice, and you see my face, and Oscar uses my name. But it's telling that in our languages we don't have any term to describe all the different degrees between full exposure, let's say, like on social media, and complete anonymity. I mean, I don't know if maybe you guys know, there's words and languages you know, but I don't know another word that can sort of describe just not wanting to emphasize attention on yourself. It's not anonymous, but it's not fully exposed and sort of self-centered either. But this lecture is actually looking at the relationship of Russia and the Soviet Union and sort of the Slavic nations towards the East. In fact, in the early 2000s, shortly after the 9/11 attacks on September 11th on the World Trade Center, there was a letter that was written by a reader to the Economist editor-in-chief, sort of saying, dear Economist, I take issue with the fact that you describe Muslims on Russian territory as an immigrant community. And the reader said it's not accurate, because you could argue that Muslims predate Christians on Russian soil, because Russia Christianized relatively late, like in the year 1000, and there were already significant populations of Muslims living on the territory that is today Russia. So he said that it's not accurate to say that Russians are immigrants, in fact, but they've been an indigenous part of Russia for a long time. Now, The Economist has a really particular relationship with Vladimir Putin. As you can see, they're kind of obsessed with him. I think the only person that comes anywhere close to the amount of covers that Putin on The Economist is Berlusconi, and you know what The Economist thinks about Berlusconi. So The Economist at that point started to answer and said, well, maybe it started to become a bit it waxed a little bit nostalgically, and said, what if Russia, who has a history of dealing with Muslims on its territory for 500, 600, 700 years, 1,000 years, what if Russia could lead a way forward, as opposed to this kind of war on terrorism that Western European nations in America have initiated? Because, of course, in the US and in Western Europe, or in Europe in general, significant populations of Muslims haven't been living on these territories for more than 50, 60, maybe 70 years. So it's a relatively recent phenomenon, if not less, 30, 40 years, let's say, in Germany. And this relationship, of course, towards the East is most famously put forward by Edward Said. I'm sure most of you are familiar with who Said is, Orientalism. He was the first person to define or identify this nexus of knowledge and power, that knowledge and power are always together in the imperial context, and essentially that Western Europe, for 200-300 years, was basically describing the East in a way that reinforced Western Europe's sense of superiority, right? Like Muslim nations are like people, when you read like 18th, 19th century accounts of Muslim countries, it's like people are sensuous and very sexual and very rational and very emotional, by implication meaning that Europeans are sort of rational, analytical, not impulsive, etc., etc. But I'll let him actually speak about it in his own words.
The idea behind my book on Orientalism is to seek out the origins and the coherence of descriptions of the Orient that began to appear in Europe in the end of the 18th, early 19th century, that were different from the descriptions of the Orient that had appeared before. Orientalism is really about the manufacture of the other, and that other is really of great convenience to oneself, and it is mainly done for purposes of domination. and that knowledge and domination in the imperial context almost always go together.
So the question is, what happens when it's not convenient? When you create an other that is not necessarily convenient to your own, so the definition of yourself. For example, like the Russian context. Now, in the early 19th century, the Tsar Alexander founded 3 universities outside the main capitals of St. Petersburg and Moscow. One was in Kharkiv in present-day Ukraine, which is actually eastern Ukraine, where the Russians sort of occupy the territory. Vilnius in Lithuania, and Kazan in present-day Tatarstan. And Tatarstan is a region of Russia that's sort of semi-autonomous. And Tatarstan is a really good example for those of you who are interested in understanding Russia's relationship with the Muslim world, because it's a kind of counterpoint to Chechnya. Everybody hears about Chechnya, and the narrative is that Russia sort of oppressed the Chechens because they're Muslim, but it's actually not at all the case. Chechnya was really run by warlords very early on, and it was this kind of really terrible mix of crime bosses and crime and mafia as much as politics that then used Islam to kind of justify it. And Kazan was a kind of perfect sort of meeting point of, it's to the east of the Ural Mountains, so it's officially in Asia, but by 1834, it had one of the most important Oriental studies department in Europe. It had the first Turkic languages department in Europe and the first Mongol studies languages in Europe as well. And in the history of Russia, basically the threat, the kind of the menace to Russian history has always come from the steppe, right? But what exactly is a steppe? A steppe is kind of like a middle finger to geologists because it's not exactly a desert, right? So it has a little bit of brush on there, but it's not sort of ambitious enough to be a forest, right? So it's this kind of, the way that the steppe is described is this kind of transitional geography or topography between the forest and the desert. And the steppe is really where the Tatar and Mongol hordes that occupied Russia came from. So all these sort of the Genghis Khans, the Turkic princes that ruled over Kiev and Rus, which was basically here, kind of early medieval Russia was there. But the history of Russia with the relationship of Russia to its Mongol Tatar invaders is more complex than we all imagine, because, for example, the Russian Byzantine Church, the Orthodox Church, always viewed Catholics with much more suspicion than it viewed Muslims itself, because Catholics were, of course, kind of rival faith. And in fact, many times the Turkic tribe and the Orthodox Russians would combine to fight Western Christians in some sense. So it wasn't a kind of a West versus East, Christian versus Muslim narrative at all. And Russians, I mean, there's very few things that Russia and the West agrees upon, especially when it comes to Russian history. But one of the few things that it seems that Russia and the West agree is this kind of the legacy of the Mongol and Tatar hordes, is that everything that's wrong with Russia is always blamed on the fact that Russia was occupied by the Tatar invasions for 250 years. So for example, the reason why Russia is corrupt today, feudal societies, even like dysfunctioning toilets at the Sochi Olympics, everything is always put into like the door of the yurt of the Tatar hordes. It's like, that's why Russia is behind, because these people occupied it. Russia missed out on its kind of modern development and sort of medieval sort of civic society. The one area that the only people, strangely, who seem to want to revisit the legacy of Genghis Khan and Attila the Hun are like MBA CEO type coaching people. So these are actually real books that are really popular amongst like McKinsey and sort of consultants, like the leadership secrets of Attila the Hun. I mean, I can't imagine what the leadership secrets of Attila the Hun are, but I guess it has to do with rating, and I think rating is important if you're a corporate Whig. And of course the same title on the right. But the body of the kind of the group which benefited the most from the Mongol and Tatar hordes, ironically, is the Orthodox Church, because the Orthodox Church, that's when the Orthodox Church became associated with Russian identity. Until that moment, which is normal, until you're occupied, that's when the Orthodox Church began to become like the shorthand for what it meant to be Rus or Russian or Slavic even at that point. And the reason I say it's ironic is because today the Orthodox Church is a driver of nationalism in Russia in a way that is perhaps even less tolerant than the Mongol and Tatar hordes of the 12th and 13th century. Because the Orthodox Church during the Golden Horde era was actually, even though they were occupied by the Tatars and Mongols, they were able to administer to the faithful. There was actually a lot of religious tolerance under Genghis Khan, as you probably know. you were allowed to administer to different faiths as long as, one, you paid taxes, and two, as long as you prayed for the health of the Khan. So you had this very interesting dynamic where the priests, the kind of fathers of the Orthodox Church, are publicly praising the Khan, but in private, all their sermons are cursing on they're spitting on the same, the kind of oppressors. And in fact, it was during this this time that Russia's kind of economic development was less isolated, because it was through the Mongol and Tatar hordes that Russia was put into a network of commercial trading with the Muslim world, for example, which it didn't have before the Tatars invaded. Russia was actually quite internally conflicted before. Its economic reach didn't extend beyond the Baltics at all. Whereas with the Tatar and Mongol hordes, there was trade happening across all the way to North Africa, actually. Now, we talked a little bit about this kind of metaphysical splits, this ability or this desire to put together two things that normally don't fit together, that don't fit on the same page, in the same voice, in the same register. And this relationship of Russia vis-a-vis the East is a perfect example of this, yet another example of this, because in fact, Russia is both self and other. So the construction of the other is not a construction of somebody outside itself, but it's actually a construction of an other within oneself, because Russia really does sit straddling Asia and Europe, and it really has colonized itself in a way that other countries, or let's say nations on which Said based his theory, like England and France, is not the case at all. We'll skip through this because we've seen enough about Marx and Muhammad for 2 days, I think. But I'll jump into something that also shows this kind of metaphysical splits, is that, even though a whole horde of Russian internet trolls would disagree with me probably, Russia's ego sort of swings both ways. And it really has, you can see even in the symbol, right? It's facing both ways, but also it has the Byzantine herald here and the sword, because Russia's Tsar was a representative of authority not only in this world, but also kind of representative of the faith in the next world, kind of vice-regent for Christ on earth, unlike, of course, the German or the Polish or other eagles that we see. And Russia's intellectual history has always been a kind of a debate. It started in the early 19th century about, is Russia a Western nation or is it an Eastern nation? And the first sort of volley was hit by this man here called Chadaev. And Chadaev wrote a book where he wrote it in French, which tells you what side of this debate he was on. He wrote it in French, and he wrote basically that because Russia had not achieved anything thus far, it would be better for it to start from scratch. And this, you could imagine how it went down in Russia, right? Like, he was immediately arrested, put under house arrest, and he was declared insane by the Tsar. And this is the first example of a critic or a dissident in Russian history using the label of mental illness as a way to discredit a critic, something that the Soviets did quite often. But Chadaev was actually, he's a misunderstood person, because in some sense, he was criticizing that which he loved. He wasn't hating Russia, but he actually had a real strong belief in Russian history. Just he believed that he was being polemical. And so when he's in house arrest, he issues another tract or polemic where he tries to explain himself out of the situation. And in some ways, he reminds me a little bit of you know what a tiger mom is? You know this phenomenon of tiger moms? So Amy Chua, she's a Yale professor of history, of law, and she wrote a book where she basically says that you Western people, you coddle your kids and you tell them they're special and that you're so smart and you're so wonderful and you're so beautiful. Basically, we create sort of losers as children, and that the Chinese sort of will punish their child if they're not number one in school or number one in violin lessons by not giving them food in the evening until they learn to excel better. And basically, that's the way you have to raise children. So she became known as a kind of tiger mom. And I kind of look at Chadaev as a kind of tiger mom of Russia, because he was giving tough love to a country. And so you often, I know in my own case, I don't criticize countries I don't care about. I really think about and care and criticize those countries I have a relationship with or that I'm invested in. But you won't hear me talk a lot about the UK. I don't give a shit what happens, really. Never really did. And good for them if they want to shoot themselves in the foot. That's all of that's for them. But countries like France or Russia or Iran or Germany, where I live, those are countries that are important to me. Now, in the same way that Russia, the United States has a kind of manifest destiny, like the anthem, the American national anthem of From Sea to Shining Sea. Russia had a similar manifest destiny, but it pushed in the opposite direction to the same sea, so to the Pacific, of course, just like the Americans, but instead of coming from the west, sort of going westwards, they came eastwards. And there's a great book by Alexander Etkind, who talks about how if you trace the way stations of the fur trade in Russia, that in fact Russia's kind of colonization happened through deforestation and through the fur trade, by basically hunting animals because the furs were so coveted during the 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th centuries, before they started to push even, before they went southward to the Caucasus under Peter the Great and later. And another way you could look at the kind of, very much like the Silk Route, there's another Silk Route, the fur route. And so if you trace like the caravanserais or the lodges where people, hunters would gather, you can see that it basically mirrors the expansionism of Russian history. Another way you can look at it is also the amber trade, of course. It's something that we don't often think about, but the amber trade, which is much closer for Sweden, the whole Baltic route going downwards, was super important for the Muslim world. To this day, the most important prayer beads in the Muslim world, the most expensive ones, are amber made, which is logical because amber, it comes from places where there's forests, and there's no forests in the Gulf, and so like the wealthy Gulf Muslims, that's the most sort of rare thing, is to have an amber prayer bead. But by the 15th century, the Russians have already, let's say, kicked out the Tatars for 150 years, and this fear of the other becomes fetish. So nobility in that time, the aristocratic families start to adopt Tatar-sounding names as a way to kind of be chic. So it becomes a fashion. And just to give you a sense of like how ridiculous it is for the alt-right today to look to Russia as a kind of symbol of white nationalism, is Russians are so intermixed. There's a very famous proverb that says, "Scratch a Russian, reveal a Tatar." And even if you look at the most famous Russian intellectuals, the names will have Muslim names. Rachmaninov, Rahmat. This means like a blessing in Islam. Ahmad. Anna Akhmatova, the famous poet. Ahmad comes from Ahmed. It's a Muslim word. And you can go on and on. So it's impossible to extricate Tatar Muslim origins of Russia from Russian identity. In some sense, it's. I can tell you another example. Over lunch, we were talking about how wonderful and difficult it is to travel to Israel if you're an Iranian like myself. But I took my father there in 2012, and this is the height of the kind of panic of Israel. You might have been there actually at the time. This paranoia that somehow Ahmadinejad Iran was going to attack Israel. So all the newspapers had sort of ads saying, "Get your gas mask." And anybody who knows anything about Middle East politics knows that Iran would never attack Israel. It wouldn't even touch it, because if it did so, it would itself be annihilated. The Iranians are a highly rational regime, and they're not going to do anything which is, let's say, nihilistic, like some people think, or messianic. Anyway, so we go to Israel, and there's all this crazy fear-mongering. It reminded me a little bit of the United States in 2003 before the Iraq invasion. Remember the kind of claims that by Tony Blair that Saddam Hussein was 45 minutes away from attacking Europe, which is all nonsense, of course. So people are panicking a little bit. Should we get a gas mask? Should we not get a gas mask? And my father and I, whenever somebody would find out that we were Iranian, literally people would, mostly women, but some men as well, would trip over themselves and flirt. My father loved it. He hadn't had so much attention. He's like, "Oh, you're Persian? Can you please speak Farsi to us?" I mean, literally every restaurant, every kind of storefront, hotel, they thought they really quite overtly flirting. And my father said, "This is great, this is weird. I didn't think that I'd be so popular here." I mean, he hadn't had attention like this in 50 years, you know? And I thought, this is indeed very strange. Either they want to kill you or they want to fuck you, but it's nothing in between. Right? There's no sort of normal milieu, kind of a moderate sort of middle point. But this fear of turning fetish is something that, of course, you see in the early 20th century America, where white women would fantasize about black men, and then the next day accuse the same black men of raping them and sort of fabricating lies. So it's a very typical, in some sense, I guess, Freudian sublimation of desire and fear. So as I mentioned, Kiev and Rus became Christian relatively late, in 998. Vladimir I, according to legend, invited the three representatives of the major sort of people of the book, so a Christian, a Muslim, and a Jewish representative, and had them pitch the religions to him, to which one he's going to choose. And he chose Christianity, according to legend, because of the opulent gold of the icons, the Byzantine icons, and he was impressed by the bling bling of the Orthodox Church, and there's further, and some scholars later on in the 19th century found documents showing that in fact he was considering Islam as well, and that in fact he regretted his choice because of the rampant alcoholism that accompanied Russia's history. That in fact, if he had chosen Islam, it might have sort of tempered that tendency. And here you have a great sort of image of Russia's sort of metaphysical shpagat itself, people sort of praying the Salah, the Muslim prayer, right in front of Lenin on Red Square. But what's interesting about Russia also is that, and Russian Orientalism is, Russian scholars were criticizing this nexus of power and and knowledge, and sort of how knowledge is used as domination already in the 19th century, so 50, 60 years before Said. And some of these people, these are the leading Orientalists of, let's say, late Russian Empire, early Soviet Union. And if you look at all these people, Bartold, who was a very famous Persian sort of scholar, Kovalevsky was a scholar of Mongol, Nikolai Marr was a linguist, Sherbatskoy of Buddhist and Tibetan structures. But if you look at these people, none of them are ethnic Russians. Bartold is a German Balt, Kovalevsky is a Pole, Oldenburg was a Jew, Rosen was a Jew, Marr was a Georgian, Sherbatskoy was Polish, and Kazanbek was Persian, converted to Presbyterianism. And the reason why I bring up this identity issue is not because of identity politics, but because when you're not yourself a Russian ethnic person, your identity is already multiple, meaning they were all living within the Russian Empire. They were Russian citizens, but they were Russian Baltic, or they were Russian Jewish, or they were Russian German, or they're Russian Persian, or they're Russian Georgian. So they already had to negotiate several identities at once. And they were already criticizing the idea that knowledge was going to be used in the service of power. So they were already criticizing the attempts by the Tsar or the Bolsheviks to use their scholarship to oppress other people, and saying, for example, that, even saying that Central Asia was further ahead than Christian Europe in the medieval times. Even to say that in the 18th, 19th century, when everybody was completely obsessed with kind of bringing civilization to the heathens, to Africa, to Asia, sort of taking this kind of colonial game, was quite rare. So the question is, was Russia, the Soviet Union, was it a colonial power? Well, the answer would be a very typical Russian answer. The Russians have this great word, which is like the German nein, which is basically da niet, yes, no, yes and no. Russia was, unlike the French and the English and the Dutch, the Russians didn't go far away across the ocean or halfway across the world to colonize people that they didn't know. They colonized people right across the border, the Kazakhs, the Tatars, the same people who had colonized them 400 years earlier. So it a little bit deflates the idea of kind of civilizational mission in terms of, if you know your own neighbor and your neighbor has dominated you, it would be as if the Indians had controlled England in the 13th century, and then England decides to control India in the 17th century. It a little bit sort of discredits that idea of civilizing mission. Another thing is different is that Russia and the Bolshevik ideology was anti-imperialist. So even if they did continue to exploit minorities, they had to pay lip service to the idea of anti-imperialism. So this idea that each nation or each group of people has a power for self-determination. And in fact, many times they did, as we'll see in a second. But what's interesting about Russian Orientalism is, like many of our sort of subject matters, the more we dig, the more interesting the research becomes. All the Russian Orientalists were trained by German Orientalists. So none of them studied in France, none of them studied in England, they all studied in Germany. And Germany's relationship with the Muslim world or the colonial world is even more complex than Russia's, because Germany, as you know, didn't really exist as a nation state until relatively late, sort of late 19th century, let's say. And Germany didn't become a colonial power until the late 19th century. So 150, 200 years later than France, England, and Holland. And the German Orientalism was quite rare because it didn't have colonial territories. All the scholars of the others, so scholars of Islam or scholars of Judaism, in fact, to this day, when I go to conferences, scholarly sort of academic conferences on subjects related to Islam or Judaism or let's say Middle Eastern studies, the leading scholars are still quite often Germanophone, so like either Swiss German, Austrian German, because the Germans were studying historically these subjects as a way to better understand the revelation. Because this kind of Kulturprotestantismus of German academies secularized relatively late compared to the French and the English. So they were the most, if you're going to read a medieval Muslim text, or if you're going to read like, the best texts on the Kabbalah are people like Gerson Scholem. If you're going to read a religious text, you can't do so purely analytically. You're going to miss half of the text. So what's very rare is finding a scholar who can do the analytical work. So not a priest, but a scholar, but also a scholar who's able to understand or experience the text as it's supposed to be experienced. So kind of an affective or metaphysical experience of that text. And that's very difficult to find because, as we know, you're trained in the academy to kind of, the analysis has to be clinical. It can't be experiential. And that's something which is only recently starting to be debated in Western universities. So Germany enters the kind of colonial game in 1898. Kaiser Wilhelm goes to Jerusalem, and he's starting to stir the shit, essentially. And he wants a piece of the kind of holy lamb's pie, and he goes to Jerusalem and to Damascus, and he goes to the mausoleum of Saladin. You know Saladin, right? The warrior, the famous warrior who fought against the Crusaders, but when he captured them, he didn't kill them, but forgave them. So he goes to the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus, and he notices that Saladin has a really kind of shabby tombstone, so he brings another grave with him, Kaiser Wilhelm, in marble, and says, this is much nicer, this is for Saladin, and the Ottomans, in like true Middle Eastern style, they say thank you very much, but they don't change the grave at all, they just sort of accept it and sort of put it there. So when you go to see Saladin, you have this very weird phenomenon of seeing two graves, and one says the true grave of the virtuous body of Saladin, and the other one says like the gift that we didn't move him to. And during this trip, Kaiser Wilhelm raises a toast to the Muslim world. I mean, it shows how little he understood about Islam, right? He sort of raises a glass of wine and says, we, Germany, are friends of 300 million Muslims around the world. We will be on your side. And of course, what his message is a kind of dog whistle, as we say today. His message is, if you rise up against your colonial powers, French, English, Russian, we're going to be on your side. Because of course, all those powers are enemies of Germany. So he was kind of starting to kind of instrumentalize Muslims. And the next step is, in 1915, during the First World War, the Germans and Ottomans declare jihad. But it's a very peculiar jihad. It's a kind of a jihad, a partial jihad. So it's a jihad against some infidels, like against the Russians, the French, and the English, but on the side of other infidels. So on the side of Austro-Hungarians and on the side of the Germans. And when this jihad is declared, the Germans go further and they build a POW camp for all the Muslims they capture, Muslim soldiers of other nations, of the Entente powers. And they put them in this POW camp, which is a kind of a show camp. It's a propaganda camp. The first mosque on German soil, sort of first functioning mosque, is here in Wunsdorf, so about 70 kilometers south of Berlin, in Zossen. And they give halal meat to the prisoners. They allow them to play sports. So it's really a way of them showing that not only are we friends of Muslims, but look how we treat our Muslim prisoners. Because their hope was that they would then go afterwards and be sort of German friendly against their colonial oppressors, again, against the French, against the German, against the Russians, and against English. And as you know, from yesterday's lecture, for those of you who are here, we're kind of obsessed with phonemes and sort of the way that sounds are transcribed into letters, into language, into scripts. And the first thing we noticed, there was a newspaper that the German Foreign Office issued called El Jihad. I think to my knowledge, it's the first time that a Western nation instrumentalized political Islam for its own ends. And this is, of course, what we saw later during the fight against the Taliban, during the fight against the Soviets, the American and British support of the Taliban, for example. And we've seen this many times in the 20th century, but I think this is the first time where they issue a magazine called El Jihad in all the languages of the Muslims of the world. So Arabic, Russian, Turkish. And this, when I saw this, I thought, well, it's a really weird way to write J, right? D-S-C-H. So one letter, like a J, or in Arabic, the Jim, 4 letters in German. Because of course there's no J in German, right? So they had to create a way to write the J. And when they issued this jihad, the English immediately answered back and saying, this jihad is made in Germany. And I know there's a lot of ways you can criticize something, but made in Germany is probably not the way I would criticize something. You know, like, what does that mean? Is it like super well engineered and like technically proficient jihad? What were the English trying to say? Well, I think what they meant was that this jihad is illegitimate because it was a German jihad and not like a Muslim jihad, right? And I guess today it could be a legitimate one because we have so many Muslims in Germany. We could actually reissue that jihad. But when they did this, when I started to look at, I started to think, okay, what other words in German start with D-S-C-H? It's such a weird construction. So in the dictionary, the Duden of Germany, which is like the Oxford English Dictionary, I look and all the words that start with D-S-C-H are like the greatest hits of Orientalist terms, right? Like Jalaba, the North African outfit, Jeddah, the capital of Saudi Arabia, Jinn, like a genie, Jihad, Djibouti. My favorite, of course, is Jungle Fever, because Germans definitely have Jungle Fever. Like Boris Becker and Heidi Klum are like very good examples of it. And this Genghis Khan, and I thought, well, that's strange because Germans don't, when they go to a bar and they order a gin and tonic, it's not written D-S-C-H, right? It's just a G. And when they buy jeans from Levi's, it's not Levi's jeans D-S-C-H. So obviously some J's are okay, and they just import it as a G or a J, but other J's, it's a kind of subconscious way of saying that this is not our culture. These are not our words, these are foreign. So they put this really kind of mouthful of D-S-C-H, 4 letters, for what is essentially just one sound. Now back to Russia. The first time Russia started to use the language of Orientalism and sort of to describe another people, another territory as kind of sensuous and subtropical and warm was when they conquered the Crimea from the Ottoman Empire in 1757. So yet Catherine the Great takes away the Crimea from the Ottomans, and in no way am I excusing the Russian invasion of Crimea and sort of annexation of Crimea, but it's important to recognize that when I earlier mentioned that Vladimir I chose Christianity, he did so in a city called Khersonesus, which is in current Crimea. So the Krim is very important in Russian history. That doesn't mean it belongs to Russia, but it's important to understand it's not a foreign territory. Or in some sense it is a foreign territory because it was conquered in the 18th century. And when it was conquered in the 18th century, Catherine the Great she uses it as a way to say, like, we too have Southern Empire. We also, like the French, or like the English, or the British, who have India, or the French, who have Algeria, we too have our own tropical, subtropical place. It's called Krim, and people there are also Muslims, like you guys have in India, or in Indonesia, or in Algeria and Morocco. And the Tatars answered the other way around and said that actually it's not so subtropical anymore because the Russian deforestation of Crimea caused the temperatures of Crimea to drop because the winds of the Arctic actually flow much easier now towards the Krim than they did before because of this kind of fur trade and the Russians' kind of tradition of deforestation. But what's interesting also about Krim is that what explains a lot of Russia's inferiority complex is that Russia's kind of insecurity complex vis-a-vis the West stems a little bit from the fact that Russia missed out not only by being conquered by the Tatars and the Mongols, but Russia missed out because it didn't have this, it wasn't an inheritor of Western civilization. You know this myth that all of us believe that somehow Europeans and Americans, our culture comes from ancient Greece, right? The myth is that the Greeks and the culture went up to Italy and Rome, and then Rome into Italy, and Italy into France and England and Germany, which we know is nonsense because it was interrupted by several hundred years where that knowledge was passed through the Arabs and Islam in Andalusia and then translated back. But anyway, that's how we learn when we go to universities in this Western civilization, the Greeks, and we have Greek names on our libraries and all this kind of self-edifying. The Russians missed out on this, but when they conquered the Crimea, they were able to claim that actually they also had their own Greek civilization because until the 9th or 10th century, Crimea's lingua franca was Greek, and there was a sizable population of Greeks living in Crimea, which is why you have these kind of very Greek architectures all across Crimea, but also it's why Catherine the Great changed the names of the territory. So she changed the name of Crimea to Tavrida, Taurus, which is a kind of the Greek name. You remember Iphigenia by Euripides? Iphigenia of Taurus, right? The reason why Euripides put Iphigenia in Taurus is because even then, during the Greek times, Crimea was considered to be a liminal space, kind of a limit of, that's where the barbarians started. But that's why she wakes up at some point, I think, and she realizes that she's living amongst foreign heathens, and she asks, and Orestes comes and rescues her. And so she changed Crimea to Tavrida. She changes the river of the Dnieper to Borysthenes. She gives these kind of very Greek important sounding names or toponyms to what are not before relatively, let's say, Turkic or Slavic. In fact, Odessa, which is another very Greek sounding name, and I associate, of course, Odessa with a very important sort of Jewish Russian literature, Isaac Babel, and an incredibly important Jewish history and culture. Actually, Odessa's name earlier was Hagi Bey. Hagi Bey is pretty Turkic and Muslim sounding, right? So you see the original Muslim roots of a city like Odessa. Here's Catherine doing our famous splits. Now, Catherine, of course, also allowed for a certain amount of self-determination because she allowed, for example, in Kazan, in present-day Kazan, in the Kremlin basically means fortress. And in the Kremlin of Kazan, if you go there, within the Kremlin walls, you have a mosque that was built by Catherine the Great. So Islam was recognized already in the 18th century as an important sort of indigenous faith of Russia. And this colonization, this is what I briefly mentioned yesterday, is that Soviets believed in this idea of self-determination for each nation. So each ethnic group was given its literature, its own folklore. You know, that this famous kind of propagandas you saw of like the Ukrainian nation would give a gift dressed in Ukrainian outfits, and to the Abkhaz nation, and Abkhaz nation to the Dagestani nation, and Dagestani nation. But all these efforts to create a national literature or a national literary tradition or a history of the nation, these are things that we can't discount and just say, oh, it's part of propaganda. Well, of course it was part of propaganda. It was part of the Soviet Union trying to show that it treated its minority different. But also, in some sense, the Soviet Union has been called the first affirmative action empire. So way before we think about affirmative action in the United States, in fact, the Soviets in the early 20s and 30s were basically giving privileges to non-Russian minorities in a way for them to catch up and also a way for them to balance it out. Because Russia has an incredibly rich ethnic diversity of over 130 different languages within one nation. So it's like America, the United States, but without the idea of all these diversity coming from somewhere else. It's coming from the land itself in some sense. So people like Mar were instrumental in creating the first Abkhaz literature. For example, here two Abkhaz writers on these coins, or even Sherbatskoy was supporting the first sort of Tibetan studies of Tibet. And this is the third argument why Russia doesn't fit into the model of England and France, is that the Bolsheviks immediately trained local scholars in the 20s to be scholars of their own cultures. So you had immediately, by the 1920s, Kazakh ethnographers and Kyrgyz writers, etc., etc. Now, So when Edward Said's Orientalism came out, it happened to coincide with the Iranian Revolution in 1978. The book came out, and if the PR team of Viking Press that published Orientalism had coordinated with Khomeini, which they didn't, but if they had, they couldn't have imagined a better like 1-2 punch. Because when Khomeini came to power and the revolution came, basically it was also another way of kicking out the Western influence of Iran in the same way that Orientalism was trying to question the use of that Western influence as a form of sort of knowledge production and domination. And what happened was immediately the studies of Oriental studies were decimated because the Shah was a big supporter of funding studies abroad of Persian culture, Turkic cultures, basically kind of a benefactor, a patron of these kinds of studies. And that was gone after the revolution. And with Said's book, we started to rightfully question, why are people studying the Middle East from the West? Are they doing it for the right reasons or are they doing it for the wrong reasons?
Discourse is a regulated system of producing knowledge within certain constraints, whereby certain rules have to be observed.
No, can you look at exports?
Yes, sir, you American did.
To seek past it, to go beyond it, not to use it, is virtually impossible. Because there's no knowledge that isn't codified in this way about that part of the world.
Now, the problem with Orientalism is, like this yesterday we spoke about this Thomas Merton quote, quit this world, quit the next, and quit quitting. This idea that no matter how liberating an idea is, at some point that idea becomes an obstacle. The same thing which helps you at some point is going to hurt you if you're not careful. Orientalism has become a little bit like that in the sense that it was a very important critical study of the way that the East was represented and studied. But today, unfortunately, it's become as much an obstacle to knowledge as it has become a new way of knowledge. And what I mean by that is that, God forbid you're a white, gay man, Christian man, studying the Middle East, it's going to be much more difficult for you to get funding to study, let's say, an obscure 12th century Muslim text, because there's going to be many more questions and sometimes many more agendas against your position. So the kind of worst kind of identity politics today actually is kind of precursor of what we're seeing today. It's happening with Orientalism, meaning that you're not able to study something unless you're from that culture. And what that means is that we've thrown out the baby with the bathwater. So I'll give you one example. The most important study of a 12th century, very important saint, martyr, whose name is Hallaj, is done by a French scholar named Louis Massignon. And there's 4 volumes, right? These 4 volumes are about this big each, this tall, they're this thick, and they come in a little box set. It's so extensive, this hagiography of the saint, that one volume is only bibliography, it's 300 pages, and it's 8-point type. Right? This has never been done in Turkish, in Arabic, in Persian, in no other language. But today, his study is unfortunately discredited in kind of hip critical study circles because he was a white French man who happened to be gay, and there's a lot of Orientalists that were gay but didn't come out because of whatever circumstances, but he married in the end. And so all these things are ways to kind of discredit his actual scholarship, which have nothing to do with the actual scholarship, which have to do with the man himself or the woman herself. And in some sense, in that way, I would say Orientalism is a little bit like anti-Semitism, right? If somebody levels Orientalism at you, it's almost impossible to shake it off. So like, if somebody says that you're an Orientalist, right, and I can argue, well, how can I be an Orientalist? And people have done this to us. They say, oh, you guys are Orientalists. You have colorful things in your work, and you study the East, and you have Arabic writing in your pieces. Isn't that Orientalist? Well, I say, well, I don't know. Maybe it is, but we do research in 4 different languages, and often the language of the primary language of the material itself, and we happen to be from the region, etc. But it doesn't matter because people say, oh, you're just self-Orientalizing, right? You know, you were studied in the West. That means you're just an Orientalist. You just don't know it yet. And I think a perfect example is, and I'll end with this figure because I'm totally obsessed with him. Actually, my dream is to make a monument to him in Hungary. Ignaz Goldziger was the first non-Muslim admitted to study at Al-Azhar University. For those of you who are not familiar with Al-Azhar is like the Vatican and like Harvard together, but for Muslims. So it's like the Muslim university, it's in Cairo, it's the seat of learning. Goldziger was a Hungarian Jew, and he's still to this day considered to be the most important scholar of Islamic jurisprudence, so Islamic law. To this day, 100 years later, is still very valid and very important when he studied. So he goes to Al-Azhar and he spends 3 days sitting down with the sheikh, a Hanafi sheikh, and the sheikh grills him, like, are you credible, or are you qualified to study in Al-Azhar? And only after the 3rd day, when he agrees to accept him, does the sheikh admit to Goldziger that his father was also a Jew. So essentially, you had 2 Jews determining or arguing sort of what it is to be a Muslim in the late 19th, early 20th century. And in the end, he was able to study there, and he continued to prolifically publish both in Hungarian and in German, but was never recognized in his lifetime, sadly. Thank you very much for your patience these past couple days, and hope to see you soon.